with that being said, welcome to the last and final Entangled Political Economy Research Network of 2023. Right, we have made it through the entire calendar year thus far, and we're going to conclude with one of the highlights for the semester. So today we've got Verlan and Hyrum Lewis. They've authored a fantastic book, The Myth of Left and Right. I first found out about it from Matt Kibbe's podcast back in, I believe, January. I'll send the link to that. They've also had a great discussion with Brian Kaplan and Robin Hanson. So just for some context for the two of you, almost everyone here is either a George Mason employee, graduate, or is at least very familiar with George Mason University. So we love and cherish having both Brian and Robin on our faculty. They're just really fun. So I'll send links to all those things, those interviews as well, so you can watch Robin attempt to get a whole bunch of gotcha questions in on Verlan and Hyrum, and then skillfully deflecting and debating with him. It was a really fun one to kind of watch and get a good summary this morning. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to them for their presentation. Just to give a brief reminder, so the object today is to hear from Verlan and Hyrum for 20 to 30 minutes or so about their book, give us some highlights, some challenges, directions you've gone since writing this book, and then we can chime in.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, David. So I will just start by saying I had some time to put together some slides. So I'm going to be doing the presentation for about 25 minutes. But I do want to say that Hyrum is definitely the first author on this book. He did the lion's share of the work on it. So I'm glad he's here to be a part of the Q&A as well. And thanks for the shout out to the interview we did with Brian and Robin. Enjoyed that, especially because I feel like they understood the arguments of our book better than a lot of people. So that was refreshing. But I hope we can also clear up some of the misconceptions that remained from that interview as well. So yeah, just to start off, I actually, what I will do is I'll pull up, if I can, I'll just share my screen so I can share some slides with you. Oh, actually, Dave, can I ask you to enable that for me? Try again.
There we go.
Okay.
Got it?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay, can you see my screen okay? Okay. So I don't need to explain to you what the left-right political spectrum is, because everyone in this audience already knows what it is. And that is because it is the dominant paradigm of contemporary public discourse. Whether you read a newspaper or an academic journal, watch the news on television, or download a podcast on public affairs, you will inevitably hear the terms left and right, progressive and conservative. Thinking about politics in terms of a left-right political spectrum is ubiquitous in our culture. Now, the left-right intellectual framework not only dominates the public square, but also the ivory tower. In the 1920s, historians imported this political framework from revolutionaries in Russia, and in the 1950s, political economists adopted the idea of ideological space in their formal models of political decision-making. This image is from Anthony Downes's Economic Theory of American Democracy from 1957. And as political economy has increasingly dominated the discipline of political science, so has the left-right political spectrum. So as Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson recently noted, the idea that political behavior can be usefully modeled on a unidimensional left-right ideological spectrum is the master theory, as they call it, of the last half century of American political science. The APSA even recently commissioned a task force to study an issue they call polarization, which is an analytical concept based on the assumption that politics can be modeled on a unidimensional spectrum with two poles, left and right. And for proof of polarization, most political scientists, including the ones that are shown with their book covers on this slide, rely on Poole and Rosenthal's famous DW nominate roll call scaling application, which we can talk about in more detail in the Q&A if you're interested in that. So despite the overwhelming acceptance of left-right thinking among today's professoriate and media, we make the bold claim in our book that all of this thinking is nonsense because it is based on a myth. We cannot accurately or usefully talk about politics in terms of left and right because there is more than one issue in politics. But a unidimensional spectrum, by definition, can only measure one issue. Likewise, we cannot sensibly talk about an individual or party moving to the left or moving to the right over time because the very meanings of left and right are constantly changing. Okay, so that's the argument of our book. And the fact that there is more than one issue in politics is in one sense too obvious to even assert. Why write a book about such a simple point? So what do those who speak of left and right mean when they use those terms? Usually, if pressed, they respond that there is one big issue that determines the hundreds of smaller issue positions for each side of the spectrum. And we call this the monist theory of politics. The most common one big issue proposed by monists is the issue of change. It is proposed that those on the left are in favor of change and those on the right are against change. So how someone views this one big issue determines their positions on all of the others, on tax rates, abortion, deficits, gun rights, spending, drug laws, the Ukraine war, same-sex marriage, international trade, and on and on and on. Now, in our book, we test this theory and we analyze this claim. And we show that this idea of change as the proposed essence of the left-right spectrum does not stand up to scrutiny. In reality, both groups who call themselves left and right want to change some things and preserve the status quo on other things. It entirely depends on the issue. So for example, Team Right currently wants to change tax rates to be slightly lower, while Team Left currently wants to change tax rates to be slightly higher. They both want change, just in different ways. And of course, in the 1960s, it was the reverse. Back then, those on Team Left supported JFK's tax cuts, and those on Team Right, like Barry Goldwater, opposed his tax cuts. Or to take another example, when Obama was president, self-described conservatives wanted to radically change America's deficit problem by calling for drastically reduced government spending, while self-described progressives resisted any progress on solving America's debt crisis, but instead maintained the status quo. And then, of course, when Donald Trump became president, Team Red stopped talking about deficits and Team Blue started complaining about deficits. Or think about the 1970s and 80s. Conservatives back then wanted to change American trade policy by lowering tariffs toward free trade, but conservatives now want to change American trade policy by increasing tariffs toward protectionism. Team Red wants to change, not preserve, the current environmental policy regime toward drilling oil, toward the Supreme Court's current policies about prayer and Bible reading in public schools, toward education policy, toward the welfare state, and so on. So which issue each team wants to change or conserve depends entirely on the issue. For those who identify with Team Left or Team Right, it is not a disposition to change that determines their position on the hundreds of issues related, but the social cues that they receive from their team. So whether a progressive or conservative wants change or conservation of the status quo depends on the issue and the time and the place. Now, of course, there are overarching philosophies and principles that can and do bind together issue positions for many people, but these philosophies, worldviews, or dispositions have nothing to do with left or right. So, for example, some people are predisposed to being having more government interference in their lives than others, but that does not map onto left or right. Whether Team Left or Team Right is calling for more or less government intervention depends on the issue and the time. In the 1950s, when Team Right controlled America's dominant cultural institutions, it was Team Left that called for free speech and challenging the culture's orthodoxies. Today, self-identifying progressives control America's dominant cultural institutions, and it is people who call themselves conservatives that are now calling for free speech and challenging cultural orthodoxies. So there are many big overarching philosophical issues in politics that can divide people into two groups: religious faith, community, national security, environmental protection, right? Lots of issues you can think of. But they cannot divide people into left and right, because left and right are social constructs attached to evolutionary political parties whose issue positions, attitudes, principles, and philosophies are constantly changing. Okay, so instead of the monist theory of politics that is dominant in our culture, in our book, we propose the pluralist theory of politics. Instead of asserting that there is just one big issue in politics that divides people into left and right, we assert that there are hundreds of issues in politics that may be coherently and philosophically bound together in many different ways by various philosophical worldviews, but that these issue positions do not naturally fit together according to what currently flies under the banners of liberal and conservative. Okay, so each theory, the monist theory and the pluralist theory, makes predictions that we can test to see if we can falsify them. And this is what we do in the book. The monist theory predicts that since one big essence defines the political spectrum, we should find people holding a consistent set of left or right positions independent of socialization. For example, if wealth redistribution, abortion rights, corporate regulation, open immigration, free trade, and interventionist foreign policy really do share the left-wing essence of being pro-change, we should find that these issues naturally correlate across time, space, and social conditioning. But in fact, we find the opposite. The bundles are constantly changing. Political psychologists have shown that no one holds political views that fit current ideological molds until after they are socialized into the left-right way of thinking. So the less tribal and the more ignorant of the political spectrum someone is, the less their views will align with the current ideological configurations. The pluralist theory, on the other hand, predicts that since the positions associated with left and right at any given time are not natural but social, we should expect to see people on the left and right changing their political views depending on what their team is doing. And this is exactly what we find. Michael Barber and Jeremy Pope showed in experiments that self-identifying conservatives would strongly agree with a policy, such as raising the minimum wage, when told that Donald Trump supported it, but would strongly disagree with that same policy when told that Trump opposed it. There was no commitment to an essential principle, such as limited government or free markets, but only tribal solidarity. Now, some might assume that this position switching based on social cues only happens among the uncommitted, the weak ideologues on the margins. But the experiments actually show that the more committed someone is to their ideology, the more likely they are to change their positions. That's because these ideologies are groups. They're not enduring philosophies. And there are a small minority of people willing to change parties or ideological groups as the meanings of left and right evolve. And we find that as more evidence for the pluralist theory, because they have their own principles and issue commitments that are entirely separate from what is now called left and right. So these are pluralist thinkers that realize there is more than two potential bundles of issue positions. After all, their own bundle does not perfectly match up with either of the two bundles on offer, and they will switch parties and ideological groups as the meanings of left and right, Democratic and Republican, evolve to become more similar or more at variance with their own particular political opinions. Okay, so whenever someone invokes the left or the right in their speech or writing, the only way they can do so in a rational way is if they are referring to a social group or a tribe. While there is no such thing as a left-right spectrum, there are groups of people who call themselves left and right. And so we have to acknowledge the words that they use to refer to themselves, even if their self-identity is a fiction based on a myth. To decrease the confusions caused by the left-right spectrum, we should use words and labels that accurately refer to groups when we are talking about groups. For example, Republicans and Democrats, or Team Red and Team Blue. And ideas when we are talking about ideas. For example, libertarianism, socialism, populism, intersectionalism, traditionalism, etc. If we use ideological labels like left or right or progressive or conservative to refer to social groups, we are reinscribing the false idea that there is in nature a left-right political spectrum. We would be better off refusing to reinscribe that fallacy. We should refuse to indulge in people's self-delusions about their identity if those self-delusions are doing social harm. Okay, so I should probably pause here to clarify two frequent misconceptions of our argument. These are two of the ones that we hear maybe the most often. The first misconception is that we do not believe people can act rationally in politics, or that political principles cannot bundle together a wide variety of issue positions. And we're definitely not arguing for that position. We're simply saying that any rational philosophy or political worldview that informs your political activity or bundles together your issue positions has nothing to do with left or right, which are constantly evolving post hoc rationalizations of whatever the Democratic Party and Republican Party happen to be doing at any given time and place. So their connection with political parties and the inevitable change associated with alternating control of government institutions makes left and right mutable and unstable. A given individual can be philosophical, rational, consistent, and principled, but left and right cannot. Okay, the second misconception that we often hear is that we are against political parties in general, or a two-party system in particular. And we're not arguing for that position either. We are simply saying that there is no unidimensional left-right ideological space on which political parties move around on. Whatever the Democratic Party is up to is what currently defines the left, and whatever the Republican Party is up to is what currently defines the right. So we should use language and words that clearly reflect when we are referring to social groups, like party labels, and when we are referring to systems of political thought, like socialism or nationalism or something. But to use the language of left and right, or liberal and conservative, confuses this important distinction. Okay, so of the two theories that explain the uniting of distinct political positions into bundles, what political scientists call ideologies, the pluralist theory is far more plausible than the monist theory. There is plenty of evidence that tribalism is natural, but there is no evidence that left-right political categories are natural. To be useful, terms must be predictive, but the terms left, liberal, right, and conservative are only predictive in a social sense, not an essentialist sense. That is, they indicate who people support across contexts, but not what they support. So ideological essentialism does not stand up to scrutiny. Okay, so that's kind of the argument that we make in the introductory chapter. And in the rest of the time that I have, I just want to maybe run through the outline of the book for you and briefly talk about each chapter. So in chapter 2 of our book, we briefly trace the origins of left and right in the French National Assembly, its adoption by Marxist revolutionaries in Germany in the 19th century, its prominence in the thinking and writing of Bolshevik revolutionaries in Russia in the 1910s, and its importation from Russia to America by self-identifying progressive intellectuals in the 1920s. From there, it has spread like a virus over the past century. You can see that in this Google Ngram illustration of its exponentially increasing use in English language publications. So what we see is that as left-right thinking has come to dominate American political discourse, a commitment to pluralism and a tolerance for dissenting viewpoints has shriveled away. We've seen that in recent decades. The myth of left and right tells partisans that their political group is correct about everything and the other political group is wrong about everything. So American ideologues today call not for party government, where party oppositions take their turns controlling or sharing the institutions of government. They call for the complete defeat and elimination of their enemies, with secession or revolution an option if they fail in the electoral arena. Okay, in chapter 3 of our book, we chronicle how the changing content of Democratic and Republican Party ideologies has driven the changing content of liberalism and conservatism, or of the left and the right, as they're called. And on virtually every issue in American politics, our two major parties and their associated labels, left and right, have switched positions. There's no essence uniting all of their various shifting positions. I won't take time to go through each instance, but happy to talk about that history in the Q&A if you're interested. In chapter 4 of our book, we take on some of the most common responses we hear to our argument. So while many people will concede that the essential difference between left and right is not their attitude toward change, but some other essence, and I will not bore you with the details, but we take time in chapter 4 to debunk about a dozen of the most commonly proposed essences. Some of them I've listed here on this slide. And unsurprisingly, we find that the proposed essences are often self-serving to the side of the political spectrum to which that person identifies. In chapter 5, we try to answer the question as to why, if the left-right political spectrum is false, it has persisted for over a century. And we identify 3 potential reasons in chapter 5. So first is the love of simplicity. So for example, the four humors theory of medicine was a simplistic but false model of human biology that persisted among the educated elite for hundreds of years. It was very simple, reducing medicine to the job of balancing just 4 bodily fluids, but it was utterly false and very harmful. For centuries, medical doctors bled their patients to death, operating on a false model of human health. A second reason the left-right political spectrum is attractive is because it allows human beings to disguise their tribalism. The need to belong to a group and defend that group and attack its enemies is a deep-seated part of human nature. A rational partisan would admit his partisanship and concede that while his party is not correct about everything, he prefers it in general to the other party and thus will work for its success. But the irrational partisan tells himself a lie about one big issue, dividing 2 great philosophies, one that is wise and righteous and correct about everything, and another that is foolish and evil and wrong about everything. The irrational partisan acts like a tribal lemming, but uses his reason to tell himself that he is actually a principled philosopher king, simply acting on the dictates of his grand philosophy. And then finally, a third reason the spectrum persists is that our 2 major political parties have an incentive to prop up the myth. Party position change could be seen by voters as disingenuous, hypocritical, or unserious. But the myth of left and right allows party leaders to tell voters that there is no party position change. Since left and right are hollow vessels into which anything and everything can be placed, every apparent change by the party can be justified as simply a continuation of the party's left or right ideology. So for example, this is what Franklin Roosevelt did in the 1930s. He campaigned in 1932 as a typical Democrat, criticizing Republicans for too much government spending, too much concentration of power in Washington, and too much government regulation of society. That was typical of Democratic campaigns in the 1920s and early 1930s. But after winning election, FDR did all that Republicans had been doing, everything that he'd criticized them for doing, and more. And to justify this seeming departure from the principles of Jefferson, Jackson, and Cleveland, as Al Smith puts it in this quote here, FDR argued that it was all of one piece with their liberalism. His voters accepted his claim that the New Deal was liberal, and in so doing, redefined the meaning of the term. A few sticky ideologues like Al Smith and his American Liberty League protested this betrayal of the Democratic Party's principles, but they were in the minority. Most people just went along with the redefinition. Now, some opponents of the New Deal insisted that they were the true liberals, but they eventually had to come up with a new label for their ideas because the term liberal was no longer accurately communicating their views. Some started calling themselves libertarians or classical liberals or even conservatives. Okay, so getting towards the end here, the subtitle of our book is How the Political Spectrum Misleads and Harms America. And so far, I have focused on the misleading character of the left-right spectrum. But in chapter 6, we focus on the harm it is doing to American society and politics. First of all, it promotes dogmatism, extremism, mental prisons, confirmation bias, and media echo chambers. In his studies of successful forecasting, Philip Tetlock found that the most accurate political thinkers defied ideological categories. They were political deviants. By contrast, poor forecasters were united by the fact that their thinking was so ideological. The primary driver of irrationality in politics today is not left-wing ideology, as conservatives would tell us, or right-wing ideology, as liberals would have us believe, but any ideology at all. Ideologues often declare truth has a left-wing or right-wing bias, but the reality is that truth has a non-wing bias. So while it is possible to test and discard policies that just happen to be associated with a party, we cannot test and discard policies that we believe are outgrowths of our deeply held ideology. So under the monist illusion, one part of an ideology cannot be wrong without the whole thing being wrong, and therefore admitting error on any point falsifies one's entire ideology. This is intolerable to someone whose identity, morality, and sense of meaning are bound up with a political label. So if an ideologue agrees with the other side on even a single issue, the entire edifice of their ideology will crumble. By making politics about one issue instead of many, monism makes compromise and correction impossible. Now, since the views of ideologues are bound up with their identity and status, they see it as dishonorable to admit error and will go to great lengths to hide any evidence that does not confirm their prejudices. And we think this helps explain the rising prevalence of cancel culture within both major political tribes. The fear of the ideological house of cards collapsing leads ideologues to refuse to listen to different points of view and to hide in media echo chambers. Okay, so in addition to this intellectual harm, the left-right spectrum promotes moral harm, including prejudice, bigotry, and hostility. As other kinds of prejudice have declined in America, ideologism has risen to fill the void. Racism leads people to judge and hate based on ancestry, while ideologism leads people to judge and hate based on political labels. By telling us that there are two and only two ways to approach politics, the monist theory inherently pits a heroic, enlightened side against a villainous, foolish side. As Webster and Motta put it, quote, Americans have come to dislike members of the other political team deeply enough to believe that others should suffer physical harm as suitable retribution for holding differing opinions about contentious issues, unquote. So the standard explanation for why American politics has become so heated is that each party has been captured by an extremist ideology. But actually, American politics is so heated because we are enthralled to a false paradigm. In practice, the parties are not much farther apart on most key issues than they were in previous eras. For instance, on gay marriage, trade policy, entitlement spending, Ukraine war policy. But we are led to think otherwise because of essentialist illusions. Increasing ideological tribalism in American society is contributing to what political scientists call increasing affective polarization, the tendency for individuals to have more hostility and antipathy toward their political opponents independent of substantive disagreement. So as you can see here from this Pew Research Center graph, the myth of ideological polarization is promoting a reality of affective polarization. Okay, so finally, the false left-right political spectrum is undermining constitutional government in America. In order for our republic to survive, we must have citizens who embrace pluralism, concede to the outcomes of free and fair elections, respect the rule of law, protect the separation of powers, and respect the individual rights of their fellow citizens. Unfortunately, ideologism undermines all of these important bulwarks for our constitutional order. When a citizen views politics as a Manichaean struggle between left and right, then there is no reason to embrace pluralism and tolerate differences of political opinions. Partisan opponents are not people who you disagree with on just a few things, but on everything, including the most basic ideas about human nature and morality. So to defeat the other party is not just to advance a particular coalition of social groups and issue positions, some of which you agree with, some of which you disagree with, but to vanquish the forces of evil and advance the forces of righteousness. Okay, so to conclude, I know I'm out of time. Given the tremendous intellectual, moral, and political harm being inflicted by the left-right way of thinking, what can we do to improve our situation? In our final chapter, we recommend that responsible citizens should recognize the left-right spectrum as a myth. Talk about politics on a granular, issue-by-issue basis, rather than resorting to the totalizing language of a unidimensional spectrum. We can change our speech to accurately reflect that our two major parties are social groups with an ever-changing grab bag of issue positions rather than timeless, enduring philosophies arrayed in eternal battle with each other. We can find healthier tribes. And finally, we can talk about politics with people who have different priors with us, or maybe even belong to a different political group from us. Okay, so we applaud the Entangled Political Economy Network for modeling these intellectual virtues, and we appreciate you listening to our argument against the myth of the left and right today. And we'll open it up for questions.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. So first, I'm going to open it. The chat's open. So if there are any questions that you wish to ask, you can either raise your hand or put it in the chat. I see Dick has his hand up. So I'll go straight over to Dick Wagner.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it raises a number of very interesting, thought-provoking questions, some of which I will confess to not having strong kind of ideas about how to deal with them. I think your presentation raises the question of, behind that, I agree totally in terms of left and right is a useless kind of characterization. I think there's no question about that. But where my thinking then leads me to do you have some kind of theoretical framework that accounts for how it is that such a misleading language comes into existence? That, for instance, if you go back to 1962, one of the most prominent books in public choice was Bill Riker's Theory of Political Coalitions. Now, that book was organized on the idea that competitive political parties are going to create coalitions that basically it was a theory of minimum size winning coalitions that both parties would aim for. Now, I think Riker's 1962 formulation is, I think, probably congruent with Carl Schmitt's 1932 theory of politics, where in his formulation on I forget the title of the book now, it was in German, but in his formulation, politics and politics and enemies, and Schmitt's friend enemy distinction, I think, can map into Riker's theory of political coalitions. And both of those are consistent with pluralistic kinds of conceptualizations of society. But what I find myself turning to is, as you said in your presentation, that it wasn't always this way. Life was more sensible once upon a time. And one thing my mind turns to is whether there is something in terms of what has happened in a world where politics now consumes somewhere around half of everything, when there is no place whatsoever where politics can't jump in. That is to say, in terms of the regulatory state, there, even now, in terms of college football playoffs, for all sakes, the Georgia senators and others are getting involved in trying to drive a legislative wedge into how the NCAA organizes its playoffs, and no one is complaining about it. It's just because there's a presumption that politics is free to go wherever it goes. And so then I wonder, don't you have to cultivate a language that makes what you're doing seem sensible somehow, when, you know, in terms of your myth of left and right, it's not really sensible. It's using in fact, destructive. But yet, is this a case of, some people have raised interesting questions about how usually we think that spontaneous orders are socially beneficial because they just evolve. But there's also points of concern that sometimes spontaneous orders can generate harmful like outcomes. But the problem happens then is that spontaneously generated harmful outcomes don't have any readily apparent way out. And but yet none of us like to say, well, this is a hopeless situation in which we're encased because we're living in it. That's not pleasant. But anyhow, I'll just drop it there. I hate to end on a nihilistic note, but I really think this myth of left and right is a very valuable formulation, and I applaud it. But it also pulls my mind into, well, how did what was the process that led to this happening? And is there any way out of it other than what most social scientists end up doing, I think, is calling upon some kind of deus ex machina, or God in the machine, that we need help here. We don't have the resources within ourselves. And so we invoke something, a change of custom, a change of institution, a change of something somewhere to get us out of this mess, pulling us in a line that makes political articulation so useless, so contrary to anything beneficial.
Yeah, maybe I can chime in here. So it seems like what you're saying is, if this paradigm, as we suggest in the title of our book and as we provide ample evidence of, if this paradigm is so destructive, then why does it persist? From an evolutionary point of view, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Things persist and survive if they have some kind of utility. I think we have to distinguish here between net utility for society and then personal and institutional utility. So does the left-right spectrum have utility for society? Absolutely not. None. It is a net negative. I don't think there's any question about that. And I'm glad we're speaking to a sympathetic audience here, because the destruction it wreaks on society is just massive. But does it have personal utility? The answer there is sadly yes. The delusion of omniscience is so appealing. This idea that all I have to do is choose the left wing and suddenly I am a champion of social justice and I have all the answers to politics. I'm God. That's just so attractive. It's very, very hard to you can just see why that's so magnetic to people, this idea. So it gives them a sense of personal righteousness. It gives them a sense of omniscience. It gives them the sense of being on the right side of history. It makes them a hero in their own self-constructed narrative of the forces of righteousness against the forces of darkness. So the individual psychological incentives are massive. So that's one of the reasons it persists. Second, there's utility for our parties. I mean, think about it. If the Democratic Party said the truth, and it is the truth, our party stands for a whole bunch of issues, some of them good, some of them bad. Okay? That's the truth. If they say that, they're not going to raise any money. If you get a letter from the party saying, hey, our party stands for a whole bunch of things, we hope you agree with enough of them to donate, you're not going to donate. But if you say the forces of right-wing extremism are on the rise, and please be a good progressive and fight for the cause of social justice and send us money, that is going to raise money. So the parties have tons of incentive there. It has huge utility power for the parties. And then, of course, you can say the same thing about our media outlets. Look, if Fox News told the truth that hey, what we believe here at Fox News, what we're talking about, it's just a grab bag. It's a bunch of stuff that's unrelated. Some of it's right, some of it's wrong. That's not going to get viewership nearly as much if you say we stand for the principles of true conservatism and we champion the cause of this, that, and the other. They fire up their audiences. They create true believers, and they get a lot more people watching their news outlets. You're much more likely to get clicks on a website and more likes on social media if you are perpetuating this myth. So yes, net utility, no. So why does it survive? Because it has institutional utility and it has personal psychological utility. Okay, so then, the next question is, I think Dick was hinting at this. Well, then, where did it come from? So it has a historical reason that it latched on. So in the 1930s, the New Deal really was the predominant issue in politics. I mean, there were other issues like segregation and so forth, but those were local issues. The federal government was not taking up the issue of civil rights, for instance. Yeah, foreign policy, it's here and there, but it's not really a major national issue. People aren't really thinking about war and peace in the 1930s. All they're thinking about is the New Deal. So when Franklin Roosevelt starts saying New Deal, more government, less government, you're either a liberal / progressive like me, and you believe in more government and more regulation and more economic intervention, or you're an evil reactionary right winger. That became a useful way, at least for most people, to kind of model politics, because there really was just one big issue: more versus less government. And so, unfortunately, it worked too well. It was so handy in the 1930s to say, where are you? Are you on the far left? Are you a socialist? Or are you on the center left? Are you one of these New Deal Democrats who doesn't believe in total government control of the economy, but more government control? Or are you one of these people who wants a little less government control on the center right? Or are you one of those reactionaries who wants a lot less government, right? So we can model one issue on a unidimensional spectrum. So it got currency in the 1930s, and people used it widely. And then in the 40s, when we started to get foreign policy and then anti-communism, and then in the 50s and 60s, we start getting school prayer and civil rights, and start getting later on issues of gay marriage and vaccines and COVID policy and all these kinds of things. Well, they kept the old unidimensional model to try to describe a multidimensional reality. And that's where the storytelling came in. People said, oh, there's all these different issues, but they must be connected by one big issue. So there's historical reasons that the political spectrum took hold and endures. And then, of course, there are individual and institutional incentive reasons because of its utility on those levels.
Could I ask Hyrum one quick follow-up question? Okay. I think your response gives some great suggestions, and I accept them. It leads me also to recall some of the ancients. There was in the ancients, there was a general sense that the democratic form didn't have long survival value, because in the democratic form was kind of the bread and circuses modality of conduct, where if people realize that they can use the ability to vote themselves largesse at other people's expense, that will become the new mode of operation. And this is a terrible thought in a way to bring forward, but your response made me wonder whether, is there the social equivalent of a aging star burning out, as our sun is going to be doing in how many billion years the astronomers project, when we're all going to be incinerated, whoever is here. And so that's our fate based on existing kind of cosmological theories. And whether, if we in the age of at a certain stage of advanced democracy haven't learned how to deal with some of the problems that lead away from, you might say, truth telling in social discourse into illusion creating in social discourse, is going to create what we're witnessing as our fate, which, if that's so, it's something that those Greeks and the tragedians and so forth, in particular, thought that basically people did themselves in because they weren't able to deal with their own beings, their own situations, temptations, and so forth. And so it wasn't someone else who did you bad. It was you who undid yourself. And maybe we're witnessing I hate to say this, but maybe we're witnessing the social equivalent of that. And that's what your comments, Hyrum, made me start to think. Well, in a way, I like to banish the thought, but I can't.
Well, I hope you're wrong. Obviously, we all do. And I let me just push back a little bit. Dave, I think you were affiliated with the Acton Institute, or still are. Is that correct? Yeah, and I think it was Lord Acton who said, you know, democracy works great until the public figures out they can help themselves to the treasury, right? And so I get where you're coming from. It's kind of the opposite of Fukuyama. Fukuyama says, no, democracy is the endpoint of history because it's so stable and so self-correcting. Whereas, you know, there's kind of a cyclical view of democracy. The democracy starts, flourishes, and then eventually consumes itself with an out-of-control public. I'm more of, not of the Fukuyama. I'm not a determinist of any form, either of the democracy is destined to die or democracy is the endpoint of history. I think that democracy, the reason I'm believe in the endurance of democracy is because it's self-correcting. And so it sometimes takes a while to self-correct. But Sir Karl Popper pointed out that democracy is analogous to science in that way, is that by internal dissent and criticism, you know, you've got these self-corrective mechanisms. So I think it can correct itself. But that's what we're trying to do here, is because bad paradigms cause democracies to die. That's what caused the Weimar Republic to die. The German people just bought into a bad model of reality. So it's not that Weimar had to go the way of fascism. It's not like there was some inevitable law leading to the rise of fascism in Germany. It's that people bought into bad paradigms about race and ancestral grievance. And these kinds of, this way of thinking led to anti-democratic outcomes. So yes, if we continue in this left-right paradigm, I do think that paradigm itself has anti-democratic implications. In fact, I know it does. We see it every day in the rhetoric of Trump. We see it every day in the rhetoric of tri-blue extremists and so on and so forth. But if we could get rid of that paradigm, we would have much more self-correction and much more democratic hope than we're currently seeing. Anyway, I'll shut up and let Verlan chime in. I've said way too much.
No, that was, I was glad you said that. I would, maybe the one thing I would add, you had an early question about how this maybe fits with kind of the party coalitions theory of politics. And I actually do think our pluralist theory of politics fits pretty well with that understanding that, you know, parties are coalitions of groups and individuals that come together to achieve a certain end. And if you have, say, a dozen issues on the table, you have these groups come together and say, hey, we can't agree on everything, but maybe we can agree on these 7 issues. And these other 5, we're going to have a lot of different views on, and we're just going to leave those off the table. We're going to focus on, you know, these 7 things. I think that's what parties do, and I think that's a realistic understanding of what parties do. I think the monist theory is a distortion to say that all 12 of those issues somehow have some philosophical coherence behind that. Now, it is true, I agree with you that parties have an incentive to come up with a story to bind their issue positions together. That's, I think, always been around, and that was happening before the 1920s, before the left-right spectrum was imported into America. I think it's interesting that earlier, for most of American politics, these parties would come up with stories, you know, like federalism. The Federalists would say, okay, this is why our stance on the national bank and on infrastructure spending and on tariffs, you know, all go together because we have this theory of federalism. And you might have other groups that emerge. Well, we're the Whigs, and this is why our, you know, opposition to executive power goes hand in hand with our view about internal improvements or whatever, right? And you could have Democrats and Republicans, and you used to have new parties coming up with new stories. That was the norm in American history until the 20th century. Once the left-right spectrum was adopted, we still have the same party names that we had 120 years ago. That's kind of interesting, and I think that's because this totalizing aspect of the left-right spectrum allows the parties to tell this lie that they're, you know, left and right. The names themselves are just spatially directive. There's no substantive content to even the labels themselves. There really are just empty vessels into which anything can be put. And as we've seen, left has meant everything and anything over the past 100 years, and the same thing with right. So they just constantly evolve the meanings of left and right, but we're still stuck with those same labels and those same terms. So I think our pluralist theory of politics is more in line with a realistic understanding of the party coalitions theory of politics. But I see other hands, so we can move on.
Great. Nils.
Yeah, hi, thanks for the good presentation. And yeah, maybe I just say a word to me. I'm a listener from Germany. I'm writing an habilitation thesis in Germany. So my question also then is a little bit linked to Germany. Yeah, I liked most of what you said, but what I was a little bit missing is that when you have a one-dimensional spectrum between left and right, you also have a center in the middle. And at least in Germany, all politicians, or not, maybe 3/4 of them, want to be in the middle. So everyone wants to be a center politician. And I mean, this makes sense also when you look at the median voter theorem, though you would think of that's where the most votes are to win, and that most people tend to the middle. So this would, from all the things you said, this would counter the argument that the left, one-dimensional left-right spectrum encourage extremism. So this would counter extremism, and I think a little bit it does, that everyone, if no one wants to be left and right, then everyone tends to be somehow in a more or less left-right combination position. And yeah, at least in some countries, I think you have it. So how do you explain this tendency to the center in some political systems?
Well, let me say there's an important distinction. So there's a difference between the middle of a non-existent spectrum, right? And then such a thing as being moderate, being a party moderate, right? So you can say, here's this issue. Let's call it socialism versus capitalism. Here's this issue, abortion versus anti-abortion. Here's this issue, immigration versus anti-immigration. So a whole bunch of issues. Being in the middle on each of those issues turns out where most of the voters are, right? When we're talking about individual issues. And so appealing and saying, look, I'm not an extremist on immigration. There's some people who want no immigration, and then there's some people who want open borders. I'm in the middle. I want to secure the southern border, but I want to admit skilled immigrants or something like that. That's where 80% of the public is. Or on socialism versus capitalism. These people want total socialism. These people want complete laissez-faire. I'm in the middle. I want a responsible welfare state, but with a balanced budget. These kinds of things. On abortion, there's some people who want complete unlimited abortion. There's other people who want no abortion. I'm in favor of some restrictions on abortion, but not all. Turns out that's where at least 70% of the voting public is on each of those. So when you frame it in those terms of issue by issue being on the middle, that is a good place to be and appeals to voters. But when we're talking about there's two philosophies, you're either in favor of change and social justice, or you're a reactionary who's trying to stop change and social justice, that's not going to put people in the middle. So that's why we say go granular. Talk about being on the middle of individual issues, and you will get votes, and you will be talking reality. If you say, I'm on the middle of the abortion issue, I'm in the middle of the immigration issue. When we go one by one and talk about things, it's a very effective strategy for politicians. They can do that, but they've got to get rid of the political spectrum, because as long as we have the spectrum, then we're saying, no, if you're in the middle of a spectrum, well, then you're insufficiently committed. If you're in the middle, if there's right-wing fascism on one side and then social justice on the other, and you're in the middle, well, you're half fascist. I'm not going to, I'm not going to give you the nomination. So since the parties are enthralled to this left-right spectrum, now you can see why we get non-moderate candidates being elevated, at least in American politics, because they are under the understanding that the more extreme you are on this so-called spectrum, the more righteous you are and more committed you are to this philosophy. So yes, I think maybe the Germans are doing it better than us. I'm guessing that you find more granularity in Germany than we do here in the United States. And the more granularity we have, and the more we're talking about moderation position by position, then we will both be talking about reality, and then we will get better policy.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, to echo what Hyrum's saying, here we are coming up on the eve of 2024. We have another presidential election coming up. Two historically unpopular politicians are going to be nominated by our two major parties. I mean, nobody wants to see Trump versus Biden, but that's what we're going to get. So we obviously have a broken system where the system is producing candidates that people that most people do not want. Now, there are a few people who love these candidates, and I think that's because they are misled by this false left-right paradigm that makes them support these candidates that everyone else just thinks is terrible.
Marta.
All right. Wow. Thank you. Great presentation. I want to go back to something Hyrum just said about democracy being self-correcting. So I wonder what you mean by that. Like, do you mean, you know, we go too far on the left, then we shift back to the right, right? And in that way that we are always like going between those polar ends of ideology, is that the self-correction you mean? Or, and this is, I think, something that relates to Dick's point, is it about, can we self-correct in terms of the size of government, right? Because as we play this left-right shifting, right, in this ideological game, the size of the government is growing, right? Slowly but surely. Like, that's one thing that doesn't seem to be self-correcting. And I think Dick's point was that as the size of the government grows, the polarization intensifies because the government gets into every sphere of our lives. And that's my understanding of his point. So I wonder, yeah, can you say, like, do you mean left-right self-correction? Or is it possible that there is also like the size of the government reversal, right? Because I think like if we continue to grow, doesn't look so great in the end of that.
Yeah, I hope I've been clear from this talk that since I don't believe left-right exists, we can't have a correction between left and left because we'd be correcting a big nothing. That's like saying, do you think we can have a correction on Santa Claus's sleigh or something like that? It's an illusion. So yes, you're correct on the second one. Size of government partially. Let's go back to the Acton example. So Acton says democracy works great until the public figures out that they can help themselves to the government treasury. Okay, so that's the argument for yikes, democracy is doomed. But then you think about it. So then the public starts helping themselves to the treasury. They start voting for politicians who will spend wildly. And then you get inflation. And then you get a correction on the inflation. At least that's the way it's worked here in America so far. So we have had these things where the populace was voting for very, very bad things, but there were corrections. I think we have seen that to a degree, like with COVID policy. Early on, I think the public had very bad ideas about lockdowns and so forth. But then over time, there was a correction, and I think we're in a healthier place. And I think if there was another pandemic, we'd probably take a wiser approach to it. So yeah, self-correcting in that sense, because there are, since the public has to live with the consequences of the public interest, they're going to be more in tune to the public interest than an autocrat would be. So there isn't self-correction in North Korea because there's no incentives for the Kim family to correct themselves because it's working out great for them. Verlan, you're more of an expert on this kind of democratic legitimacy stuff than I am. But
well, I think this idea of self-correction, in theory, works for democracy, but I think the false left-right framework undermines it. And so you talked about the example of ever-growing government. I think that's a great example. If you start talking astrology, if you start talking fairy tales and start talking left and right, then people can't fully understand what's actually going on in our politics, and you can't have the self-corrections that are needed. So, for example, this is within our lifetimes. In the early 21st century, Republicans got elected into office. They controlled Congress. They controlled the presidency with Bush 43. And what did they do when they were in office? They increased government spending dramatically. They increased government deficits dramatically. They increased government control of the economy dramatically. But the false left-right framework misled us. It obscured that reality. It told us a lie. The false left-right framework said, oh, look, these right-wingers are in office. And you know what right-wingers do? They're all about laissez-faire capitalism. And so look at all the, this laissez-faire policy that we've had. So in 2007 and 2008, when the financial crisis hits, and what does the demos do? They look at, bad economic outcomes. Well, what were the policies? They must have been laissez-faire capitalism. We can't trust free markets. We can't trust limited government because look what it led to. It led to all these really bad outcomes. So now we have to vote for all these bigger interventions, more government spending, more government deficits. And so you can see how the lies of the left-right spectrum that obscure reality prevent populations from engaging in the kind of democratic self-correction that you should hopefully see in a democracy.
Yeah, and so Verlan's point is a wonderful one. So you look 2008, I mean, we see the support for socialism in this country rise dramatically in 2008. And people say, oh, it's because of the financial crisis. And people think it's mostly because of the left-right framework. People believed that laissez-faire capitalism had given that to us because according to the prevalent mythology, the Republican Party was kind of center-right, but then George W. Bush got in office and pulled us to the extreme right. He was an extreme right-winger, was the prevalent narrative and still is the prevalent narrative. And since right-wingers are obviously these laissez-faire capitalist ideologues, well, then therefore the size of government must have shrunk. And so then people blamed laissez-faire capitalism for the 2008 financial crisis, even though we'd have the largest increase in government spending in the history of that country, in the previous 7 years. So like Verlan says, we can't correct and react when we are misinformed. And the political spectrum is a tool of misinformation. Now, let's imagine we didn't have the political spectrum. Let's say we weren't placing Bush on a magic line and the Republicans on a magic line. Let's just imagine that we talked policy. And we said, here's George W. Bush. What is he doing? Well, he invaded Iraq. That's one thing. And then he also increased government spending. That's a different thing. Let's talk about that. Does increased government spending produce good outcomes? Well, it gave us a financial crisis. I guess not. Let's correct. We were able to correct on Iraq, but not able to correct on government spending because our paradigm was all wrong. Excellent point, Verlan. Thanks.
I'm going to ask a real quick follow-up and then we'll go to Nathaniel. But so, Verlan, you say it's the lie of the left-right spectrum that led to the anti-capitalist mentality, the anti-deregulation. But if we look at the length of regulation on banking from 2000 to 2008, and even going back further, there's never been a period of banking deregulation that's ever happened. So my question to you would be, is it a lie of the left-right spectrum, or is it just flat out a lie?
Yeah, I think it's a lie that's upheld or supported or facilitated by the myth of left and right. Because there are other issues where I think the public has been better informed and we have had these kinds of self-corrections. But I think the left-right myth is promoting it and facilitating it in a way, just simply obscuring what Republicans actually did in office. And frankly, actually obscuring what Democrats did in office in the 1990s. There's, I think, a misunderstanding in a lot of ways about what our parties are actually doing because we have this left-right flattening.
Yeah, and I mean, look, we're going to get misinformation no matter what. I mean, it's the human condition. But I'm just thinking, I don't know if you're religious or not, but humor me here. Look, if I'm Satan and I say, I want to destroy freedom. I want people to be miserable. I want to ruin as many lives as I can. I want people to live in North Korea. That's my goal because people in North Korea are miserable. So what can I do to make more people live in a place like North Korea? Well, I've got to get rid of freedom because freedom makes people prosperous. It makes their lives better. It gives them control of their destinies. It does all these wonderful things. I don't like wonderful things because I'm the devil. I want everything to be awful for human beings. What can I do to destroy freedom? I think literally Satan would have come up with the political spectrum. I think he just said, this is brilliant. Because what I tell people is, you've got Adolf Hitler, the most evil man in history, and he's extreme right wing. Oh, and freedom is also extreme right wing. So you better hate freedom because freedom is over there with Adolf Hitler. I mean, that's what has happened. The Nancy McLeans of the world write these books talking about free market economists at George Mason University being part of the radical right. They're over there with Adolf Hitler. And so it turns all these people away from freedom and free things and free markets and all these things that make us, happy and prosperous and peaceful because they have tainted it by guilt with false association. Hitler was a socialist. He had no sympathy for anything that the Mercatus Center or GMU was doing. None. I mean, he would have been against every single thing they're preaching. And yet the Nancy McLeans of the world, and frankly, everybody who buys into the left-right spectrum has got this idea, well, yeah, they're out there on the right, but if you take free markets too far, you'll wind up and become Adolf Hitler. So we don't want free markets too much. We got to keep that tempered. We need a good, healthy dose of socialism to prevent us from becoming like Hitler, who was a socialist. I mean, it's just, you can see the kind of insanity this introduces into our discourse. I mean, here you've got Milton Friedman, right? A Jewish anti-militarist capitalist. Here you've got Hitler, an anti-Semitic, militarist anti-capitalist. And yet we put them both on the extreme right. We're out of our minds. This paradigm just tells us lies about Hitler. It tells us lies about Milton Friedman. And it tells us lies about free markets and limited government. You can see why we, get a little more than a little frustrated with this paradigm, because it's our freedom that's on the line. It's the most precious political thing we have. And here we've got what I think is literally a satanic paradigm dominating our political discussion. We have to stop it.
Well, I mean, we all know Hitler was also a vegetarian, so I'm going to do my part to be anti-Hitler tonight and have a hamburger. On that note, let's go to Nathaniel.
Thanks for this. It's an interesting examination. I think one thing that I'd bring up is you never answer a fool according to their folly, the proverb says. And in dealing with what I'm hearing from you is that this left-right paradigm makes it easier to oversimplify arguments such that nuance is ignored. And what you mean by going granular is to introduce more nuance into the discussion, to introduce more nuance into the way we think about things. However, why is it that people rely upon these mechanisms to oversimplify things? It's because there's just too much going on, right? There's more than what we can actually be aware of. Nobody can go granular on every issue. I can't go granular on every economic issue, and it's my full-time job, right? So instead, we rely on symbols and mechanisms that help us to organize. And it's really just a mechanism, as Munger would say, of overcoming transactions costs in organizing our own thinking and organizing the way that we do things. Now, how do we do this? Well, we form groups and we participate in groups. And those groups are generally collected by the way that we talk. And the way that we talk includes all kinds of rhetorical approaches. And using the left-right paradigm is a shorthand. It's a symbol that comes to be without meaning, which is what I think you're trying to say. Symbols that come to be without meaning. Some people would call that idolatry, actually, to have a symbol that lacks meaning. So when you talk about democracy self-correcting, one mechanism that I think has been recommended in the past is that the factions that form when the size of government increases, such that there's a bigger pile of goodies and there's more competition over that pile of goodies, or when there's more of a status game afoot, and so people are seeking out status, the kind of language that gets used is more and more symbolic and less instrumental. And the way to correct democracy is to not answer a fool according to their folly, to instead address problems instrumentally. And to never appeal or argue with somebody on their position according to the rules of their own rhetoric, but not to argue about rhetoric either. To not engage in a semantical argument, but instead to even adopt the language of the opposing side and use it to describe a clear point. This is something that Arnold Kling kind of gets into in the Three Languages of Politics as well. And that I go back to Richard Whately to think about these things, about how to overcome factions. And so I think that what you want to do is to think about how, first of all, how these groups form, and then how to answer them so that they can fall apart. One hope is that the long run conversation will be sustained, and that very, very factional ways of talking go factional inward on themselves and split eventually on themselves. And to some extent, we've seen that on the Democratic Party, that the Democratic Party has gone internal in the past, and now it looks like the Republican Party is coming up to some sort of factioning and splitting in and of itself as well. And that competitive process can be analogous to a market analogous process. And there may be some hope in the long run that as long as some people are behaving pluralistically, this can happen. The last thing I'll say is, in your discussion, I don't know what's in your book, but in your discussion of how people shift from left to right and right to left, you can look at how American evangelicals have shifted from left to right. How Billy Graham was a Democrat up until Ike was president, and that he really didn't move very far to the right until Nixon, and after Goldwater. And you can look at how American evangelicals, many of them aligned with Goldwater, but also before that they aligned with who did he run against? But they align on both sides, and so how that shift has changed over time, and how it's really related to the way that these groups talk and also maybe something about media in there as well. So I know that was a bit rambling, but thank you.
No, thank you. You give some terrific insights, and I love what you said. Let me push back on a couple of points you made. So, that's probably the most common reaction we get here. Verlan, I'll be brief because I want to hear what you have to say. The most common retort to our theory is, well, yeah, it's not perfect, but it's a useful simplification. It's useful. All models are simplification of reality. And then this is a simple model that is useful and helps us kind of navigate. It's a map helping us navigate the political landscape. But look, there are useful simplifications and there are non-useful simplifications. I don't see any evidence because all simplifications aren't useful, obviously. I mean, the simplification of medicine to 4 humors was not useful. People said that, well, it's not perfect, but it's useful. Turns out it wasn't useful at all. And I just don't see the evidence for the political spectrum of pretending that a multidimensional domain is unidimensional. I don't see the utility in that. So the analogy here, you say, well, the public is, they're distracted. They can't deal with all these issues. They just need one issue. Again, I don't agree. I mean, does the public use one dimension when it comes to medicine? When they go to the doctor's office, does the doctor say you have a left-wing illness or you have a right-wing illness, or let's put you on this medical spectrum? The doctor just tells them what they have. They say, you got an infection, you got a rash, you got a fracture, you got cancer. We go granular, and patients are fine with that. Yes, medicine is complicated, because medicine is complicated, and we have to deal with that complicated reality as it is. Reducing it to a single dimension would not be a useful simplification, and we think that that's true of politics too. All right, and then your other point about the evangelicals moving left to right, again, I just think that's a misconceptualization, because the evangelicals, you look at the demography, you look at their political positions, have not changed at all. So it's the false paradigm leading us to that conclusion. Have the tribes changed? Yes. And that tribal change has meant people that have believed the same thing they always believe have changed groups. So the social theory or pluralist theory of ideology explains this very well. But the idea that these these evangelicals used to be on the left side of a spectrum, now they've moved to a right side of a spectrum, I don't see any evidence for that. These evangelicals believe what they've always believed, and the parties, and therefore the left-right labels, have shifted around them, and they found themselves in different parties, and therefore in different tribes based on the coalitional rearrangements. But this idea that they've shifted, that there's one big issue, and evangelicals used to be in favor of change, and now they've become reactionaries and moved to the right. Again, I just don't see any evidence that that's true. Verlan, what do you think? Am I off here?
Yeah, no, I mean, probably the most famous evangelical presidential candidate in American history is maybe William Jennings Bryan, and he was considered left-wing, right? That's what historians say today, for the issue positions that he had. It's not like the evangelicals today are, taking radically different positions. It's, as you say, it's the tribes are changing. And so this schema that says, oh, they've moved from the left to the right, I think confuses more than it clarifies. I think it actually obscures the historical record. And just to echo what Hyrum said about models, exactly right. So in every realm of life, we have to have models that simplify reality for us, but some are going to be useful and we should use those, and some are going to be unhelpful and we should discard those, right? So, we use maps to get around. Map is not reality, it's a representation of reality, but as long as it's an accurate map, it can help me get right from Utah to Michigan, and I can see the states along the way. But if I have a map that tells me that Michigan is actually where Florida is and Montana is actually where Louisiana is, it's going to mislead me. That's going to not get me to where I want to go. And we think that's what the left-right spectrum is. It's a misleading, harmful simplification of reality, not a helpful one.
Can I follow quickly?
Sure.
You said that it's not a useful model. Well, the question is, useful to doing what? And I think that most people don't care that much about actual good governance, but actually they care more about status within their subgroups. And for that purpose, the left-right paradigm might be very effective.
Yeah, that goes back to Hyrum's earlier point, right? So good for what? And institutionally or collectively or individually, right? So this is good for individuals in the sense that it gives them a sense of self-righteousness and status and group belonging, although we think it's bad for their souls and their intellects, because we think it makes them stupider than they would otherwise be and less charitable and more angry than they would otherwise be. And it's also bad for our society. So exactly right.
Marta, you're on mute.
Of course, that happens all the time. So I accept that the left-right spectrum is harmful and useless and everything that you said about this. And I'm a little uncomfortable with this recommendation of like going granular, because I think there's a difference between the health examples or the maps and politics, right? Because the map exists, there is a reality that the map simplifies, but politics is promises about the future, and that reality does not exist, right? So they're not really testable. So when you say go granular and try to understand, right, there is complexity and uncertainty that make it far harder or maybe even impossible to know how particular promises and or even public policies are going to actually end up affecting us. And then there is that whole, cost benefit of actively participating. But I think, yeah, I the only thing I guess, like, big picture, I'm on board with everything you said, but like that one part where I find some discomfort is this idea that that there is some sort of a reality that counters the ideology, right? Versus like that the reality does not exist. So there's no hard knowledge against which you can test ideology or challenge ideology.
Well, I think to go back to what Dick was saying, right, there are correct and incorrect theories of politics, and correct theories of politics can accurately predict what's going to happen in the future, right? So he talked about the party coalition theory of politics. If we understand the way human beings generally behave and we introduce this new variable, we can predict, okay, with some level of certainty, this is probably going to happen. That can be a useful social scientific theory. Now, if you don't think that's true, then the whole enterprise of social science is just, what are we doing, right? But if you think social science is useful or has a place in the world, then yeah, we want to have more accurate or less accurate theories of the way our politics operates. An unhelpful theory can make no predictions. And I think that's what the left-right framework does. It's just simply like astrology. You can always tell a story to back up whatever it is that happened in the past, but you can't predict what will happen in the future. So just take, for example, I remember, again, within our lifetimes, the early 21st century, after the 9/11 terror attacks and the war on terror, it became this new thing that the right wing was associated with being hawkish on foreign policy and interventionist on foreign policy. That wasn't the case in the 90s, but that became the case in the 2000s. And political scientists who believed in this false left-right framework tried to come up with a theory to explain this. And they'd say, well, the reason that Republicans are so worried about terrorism and they're in favor of the Patriot Act and they want to give up their liberties and they are in favor of, surveillance on citizens and fighting the war in Iraq. The reason that they're all doing this is because the essence of conservatism is being afraid and you're not open to change and you're so concerned about novelty. That's the essence of conservatism. And political psychologists, believe it or not, actually published books making this argument. It's laughable. It's ridiculous, but they did. And they published articles in academic journals. It's social science malpractice. And they say the essence of being on the left and being a liberal is that you're open and you're unafraid and you're courageous and you're brave. That's the difference, right? Go read Mark Hetherington. I dare you. It's just, if you can put up with it, it's amazing. This is the astrology he's getting into. Okay, so if that's the essence of left and right, now let's start making some predictions about what's going to happen. Well, just imagine this crazy thing, like maybe there's a worldwide pandemic and there's a virus. Well, we know the essence of the left, we know the essence of the right, because all politics can be flattened into this simplistic unidimensional spectrum. And we know the essence of the left is being brave and open to change and novelty. And we know the essence of the right is being afraid and worried and concerned about novelty and new things. So what do we expect to happen? Well, surely the right-wingers are going to be the ones calling for the lockdowns. They're going to be the ones saying, oh no, COVID's going to kill us all. And it's the left-wingers who are going to say, live and let live, just let it rip, because we're so open and unafraid and brave. But it had no predictive value. Of course, the opposite happened, not because of anything inherent in left and right, but precisely for reasons of tribal solidarity and historical contingency. People rallied around their tribe and they said, well, my tribal leaders are doing this, so I'm going to do that. You can't predict any of this with the left-right theory. It's just totally useless in helping us understand what happens in politics.
Great. Well, we are at 3:50, and I do like to keep us as much on time as possible. I would love to absolutely continue this conversation, but I think I'll just reach out to the brothers Lewis and see if we can co-author a paper on something that I've been inspired by with this discussion and everything. So please join me in thanking both of them for spending their time with us today. It was an excellent conversation. I enjoyed every second of it. And I actually cannot believe that an hour and 20 minutes has already gone by. So thank you so much.
Thanks,
Great.
you
Thanks
guys.
so much, everyone.
All right.
Yes,
So,
indeed. Thank you.
so our next meeting is in January with Randy Holcomb, talking about a very similar actual book on following their leaders. I see Hyrum already left, but Verlan, if you guys want to come join us for that and hear from Randy and everything, you're more than welcome. We look forward to seeing you all then. Until then, have a wonderful holiday. Those of you who are on break, Dick is always on break, being retired now, so congratulations. But for those of you on break, please enjoy your break. Have a wonderful new year, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again in January.
Thank you.